San Francisquito Canyon sits about 40 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles, a narrow cut in dry, folded hills where a creek runs most of the year, and where, in 1928, a concrete dam stood 205 feet tall across the gap, holding back a lake of water that stretched 3 miles behind it. On the morning of March 12th of that year, a dam keeper named Tony Harnischfeger walked the base of the structure the way he did every morning, and stopped at a spot along the western wall where the concrete met the canyon rock. Water was coming out of the ground there, and it was not clear. It ran the color of wet earth, thick and brown, the kind of water that does not seep quietly from a spring but carries something away with it. Harnischfeger lived below the dam with his wife and young daughter, in a small cottage close enough that the structure towering above them was the last thing the family saw at night and the first thing they saw at dawn. He had tended this dam since before it held a drop of water, and he knew its moods the way a man knows a horse he has ridden for years. Something in the mud that morning unsettled him enough to call the office in Los Angeles. By midday, the engineer who had designed the dam, a man named William Mulholland, was standing beside him at the same spot, looking down at the same brown water, working out what it meant. Mulholland brought his assistant, Harvey Van Norman. The two of them spent close to 2 hours at the site. They traced the leak, discussed it, and concluded that a road crew grading a highway nearby had disturbed the ground and colored the runoff. Mulholland got back in his car and drove home to Los Angeles, satisfied that the dam holding back 12 billion gallons of water above a canyon full of homes and orchards was sound. Before midnight, he would be proven wrong in a way that has never stopped being studied. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. William Mulholland was, by 1928, one of the most powerful men in California, and he had never earned an engineering degree in his life. He arrived in Los Angeles as a young Irish immigrant, took work as a ditch tender for the city's private water company, and rose through raw ability until he was running the entire municipal water system. His signature achievement was the Los Angeles Aqueduct, completed in 1913, a 233-mile system of tunnels, siphons, and open channels that pulled water from the Owens Valley, more than 200 miles away, and delivered it to a city that could not otherwise have grown into the metropolis it became. At the dedication, in front of a crowd of 40,000 people, Mulholland said only a handful of words and sat back down. The aqueduct made him a hero. It also ran directly across the San Andreas Fault, which worried city planners enough that they wanted a large reservoir close to Los Angeles, one capable of holding a full year's water supply in case an earthquake ever severed the aqueduct upstream. Mulholland chose San Francisquito Canyon for that reservoir. He selected the site. He designed the dam. Almost no one checked his work. Construction began in 1924. The finished structure stood roughly 205 feet high, curved to add strength. Its concrete poured directly against the canyon walls on either side. What sat inside those walls mattered more than anything visible from the road. On the western side of the canyon, the rock was a reddish sandstone conglomerate belonging to a formation geologists call the Spillway, rock that looks solid and dry but breaks down into sand and slippery clay once it becomes saturated with water. On the eastern side, the rock changed entirely into a mica schist, so fractured and thinly layered it had been sliding, slowly, for thousands of years before anyone built anything on it. Beneath the eastern abutment lay the debris of an ancient landslide, a slope that had already failed once in some distant age and simply come to rest, waiting. The dam was not built to its final dimensions from the start. It was originally designed to rise about 185 feet, and twice during construction, Mulholland ordered the height raised by 10 feet at a time to hold more water for a growing city, bringing it to its final 205 feet. He did not correspondingly widen the base to carry the added weight and the added water pressure behind it. The man overseeing daily construction at the site was Stanley Dunham, who had run percolation and hardness tests on the eastern rock and concluded, in his own words at the later inquest, that the ground there was hard and consistent across the entire abutment and entirely suitable for a structure of this size. Nothing in that testimony was a lie. It was simply wrong, arrived at without the tools or the training that would have shown him what lay beneath the surface he was testing. Mulholland was not entirely ignorant of the eastern hillside's history. In an annual report he had written back in 1911, more than a decade before the dam was ever proposed, he had noted the unstable character of the schist face on that side of the canyon. That observation did not travel forward with the project. When the dam site was chosen, no independent geologist walked the canyon and mapped the fault line running beneath it. No core samples were drilled deep enough to reveal the old slide. No one connected Mulholland's own earlier warning to the ground he was now building on. He ordered exploratory tunnels dug into the western hillside and ran percolation tests to check how the conglomerate handled water, and the results satisfied him. Formal geological review of dam foundations was not yet standard practice anywhere in American engineering in the 1920s. Mulholland, self-taught and used to answering to no one but himself, saw no reason his own judgment needed a second opinion. The reservoir behind the dam reached full capacity for the first time on March 7, 1928, 5 days before the collapse. Cracks had appeared in the concrete as the water rose over the preceding 2 years, along with occasional seepage at the abutments. Each time, Mulholland inspected them personally and pronounced them ordinary, the kind of settling any structure of that size would show. He had built his reputation on decisiveness, and by 1928, that decisiveness had hardened into something closer to certainty, the kind subordinates learn not to question if they want to keep their jobs. When Harnisch-Feger's report of muddy water reached him on the morning of March 12th, it followed the pattern of every concern that had come before it. Mulholland looked, decided, and moved on. At 2 minutes before midnight that night, the eastern abutment of the St. Francis Dam gave way. Later reconstruction of the failure, based on the physical position of the wreckage and the exact moment a downstream power line went dark, allowed engineers to establish almost the precise sequence. Water pressure building against the mica schist had been working through the rock for days, reactivating the ancient landslide buried beneath the abutment. A large section of the dam's eastern wing, a piece investigators later labeled Block 35, broke away first, opening a gap through which the reservoir began pouring in a concentrated stream. That stream tore loose what remained of the eastern hillside, the old landslide finally slipping for the second time in its geological life, and within minutes the entire dam came apart. The western wing was later found a quarter mile to half a mile from where it had stood, carried there by the force of the water. The central section, the tallest surviving piece, still stands today, alone in the canyon. Local residents call it the tombstone. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 12 billion gallons of water left the reservoir in a matter of minutes and entered San Francisquito Canyon as a wall roughly 10 stories high. It moved down the canyon at a speed that gave almost no one downstream any warning. The first to die were the Harnisch-Fegers, asleep in the cottage below the dam they had spent years tending. From there the flood widened as it dropped in elevation, tearing through a construction camp for Southern California Edison workers, then into the small settlements of Castaic Junction, Piru, Fillmore, and Bardsdale, before reaching the outskirts of Santa Paula. It carried whole houses, livestock, automobiles, and sections of railroad track for miles. More than 1,000 homes and structures were destroyed or damaged along its path. The water did not stop at the coastline for hours. It traveled the length of the Santa Clara River Valley and emptied into the Pacific Ocean near Oxnard, 54 miles from the dam, more than 5 hours after the collapse began. 3 miles below the powerhouse, at a railroad siding called Kemp, roughly 150 Southern California Edison linemen were asleep in a tent camp, stringing transmission line along the canyon floor. Their night watchman, a man named Ed Locke, heard the flood coming before he could see it, a sound he later compared to an avalanche, and he moved through the camp shouting and pulling at tent flaps in the seconds he had before the water arrived. The camp sat near a rock formation called Blue Cut, and when the wave struck it there, the water spun into a whirlpool that tore the tents from their stakes rather than simply pushing them downstream. 84 of the workers died there, Locke among them. A short distance away, an assistant Edison patrolman named Raymond Starbard was nearly swept off his feet by the same flood, made it to a garage, and placed the phone call to the Newhall Sheriff's substation that is now credited as the first official word that the dam was gone. Not everyone downstream died without warning. A California Highway Patrol motorcycle officer named Thornton Edwards rode ahead of the water for miles, stopping at farmhouse after farmhouse to pound on doors and shout for people to get to high ground, moving faster than the flood, only because he knew the roads better than the water did. Survivors and newspapers afterward called him the Paul Revere of the St. Francis flood. In Santa Paula, a telephone operator named Louise Geep stayed at her switchboard as the warnings came in, placing call after call to homes in the water's path, even as the line between her and safety kept narrowing, and she is credited with saving lives that would otherwise have simply run out of time. Their actions did not change the death toll by much set against the scale of what the canyon had unleashed, but they are the clearest evidence that the story of that night was not only a story of engineering failure, it was also a story of ordinary people doing, in a handful of hours, everything that one man's certainty had made necessary. The official death toll was recorded at around 450, though the true number has never been settled with confidence. Many of the workers living in migrant labor camps along the river valley that night were never formally counted to begin with, their names absent from any registry, and some bodies were never recovered at all. Remains connected to the flood have surfaced decades later, one set found near Newhall in the 1970s, another in 1992, the most recent in 1994, more than 60 years after the water passed through. Beyond the dead, thousands more were left homeless overnight, their farms and houses scraped down to bare ground or buried under mud and boulders that in places ran 10 feet deep, and it took work crews months of digging with tractors and hand shovels just to recover what bodies the flood had not carried out to sea. It remains the second deadliest disaster in California history, behind only the earthquake and fire that leveled San Francisco in 1906. 1 week after the collapse, Los Angeles County Coroner Frank Nance convened a jury to determine the cause of death for the victims, and the inquest that followed became, in practice, a public trial of the dam and the man who built it. It opened on March 21st and ran for weeks, with District Attorney Asa Keys questioning Mulholland directly about years of leaks, cracks, and warnings that had preceded the collapse. On the same morning Mulholland testified, newspapers had reported the recovery of an infant's body from the wreckage downstream. Mulholland did not deny his role. Under questioning, he told the jury that if there was any error in human judgment, he was the human, and he would not try to fasten it on anyone else. Later, watching film footage of the devastation played in the courtroom, he said the only ones he envied in the whole affair were the dead. Yet in the same testimony, pressed for a fuller explanation of what had gone wrong, he also spoke of a hoodoo hanging over the site, an old word for a curse or an evil presence, as though something beyond engineering had turned against the project. Keys did not let that stand as an answer. He kept returning to the physical record, the leaks, the cracks, the two heightenings of the dam, without a matching widening of its base, and the absence of any outside geologist report anywhere in the project's files. The jury's verdict, delivered on April 12th, ruled the deaths accidental and recommended no criminal prosecution of Mulholland or any city official. But its language did not read like an exoneration. It found that the dam's foundation rested on rock formations unfit to support it, and it stated plainly that the construction of a municipal dam should never again be left to the sole judgment of one man, however eminent, without independent expert review. California's Governor C.C. Young appointed a separate commission of engineers and geologists to study the failure in greater technical depth, and their findings confirmed, in more technical language, what the coroner's jury had already concluded in plain English. The ground itself had made the dam's failure close to inevitable, and no one with the authority to stop construction had ever been required to ask the question in time. Mulholland's career ended with the inquest in every way that mattered. He had spent more than 4 decades building the water system that made modern Los Angeles possible, and he spent his final years largely out of public life, a hero to some and, to the families along the Santa Clara River, the man who killed their neighbors and never faced a courtroom for it beyond his own testimony. He died in 1935, 7 years after the collapse, and is buried in Glendale. The disaster he built, inspected, and defended right up until the hour it broke apart, changed American civil engineering permanently. Within a year of the collapse, the California legislature created what would become the Division of Safety of Dams, establishing for the first time in the state's history a requirement that dam design and construction be reviewed by independent engineers, rather than left to the judgment, however distinguished, of the person who wanted to build it. For most of the 20th century, the site carried no official recognition at all, just scattered concrete on private and federal land that hikers occasionally stumbled across without knowing what they were looking at. That changed in 1990 when the ruins were listed as a California historical landmark, and again in 2019 when Congress designated 353 acres around the site as the St. Francis Dam Disaster National Memorial, placing it under the management of the U.S. Forest Service and setting in motion plans for a visitor center and a wall bearing the names of the dead. It took more than 90 years for the disaster to receive a name on a federal map to match the one it had long held in the memory of the valley it destroyed. The canyon has mostly healed since then. Grass grows over the old debris field, and concrete fragments scattered across the valley floor have largely been left where the flood put them, some now sitting on private ranch land, others visible from a trail that follows the old dam site. The tombstone, that surviving center section, still stands where the reservoir once pressed against it, cracked and weathered but upright, the only piece of the structure that never left the ground it was built on. A memorial near Fillmore lists the names of the victims who could be identified, and a marker at Bardsdale Cemetery still carries words written by a father who lost his wife and daughter that night and spent the rest of his life with only his own survival to explain. The dam that William Mulholland believed was sound on the afternoon of March 12, 1928, broke less than 12 hours after he told Tony Harnischfeger not to worry about the mud in the ground. What the coroner's jury wrote into its verdict that spring has outlived both men. No engineer since has been allowed to build a dam the way Mulholland built the St. Francis. Alone, on his own authority, on ground nobody with the power to stop him had ever fully understood. Stand at the site today, and there is little to suggest that a metropolis's worth of certainty once gathered itself into 205 feet of concrete and failed in under a minute. The creek runs quietly through the gap where the dam stood. The tombstone leans, cracked, against a hillside that has long since gone green again, but the rock underneath it, the red conglomerate and the mica schist and the fault line running between them, has not changed at all, and it was never the rock that failed that night. It held exactly the shape it had always held. What gave way was the judgment of one man who was allowed, for too many years, to answer to no one but himself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.